Administrative Services, Deb Sunday, who was there for 2 years, followed by Kevin Robinson, who followed with a dialogue program, which is an opportunity for librarians to come in small groups. We set some guidelines where you can talk freely within the environment, and if you're willing to say harsh things or strong things, be able to back them up. But we're going to hold it there. And then Kevin and Deb would take the details, bring it back to the AUL, and discuss some changes to be made. And I think to the credit for Lorelei, she has actually started implementing some of these suggestions. That we can see the things that are being discussed in our meetings actually show up in policy. Not every suggestion, not every recommendation, but they are listening to us. Because fundamentally the administration wants the library to move forward, and they would prefer it to be with the agreement of the librarians. The last thing you want to do is fight your own internal organization while you're trying to move things forward in time. So I guess the biggest thing we can do is just hold this conversation with ourselves, but we're also responsible for making a lot of this stuff happen. So you got to make a choice at some point. What do we end up fighting, and then what can we actually do to help? Because a lot of what I heard from LAUC, and I was in the same room with Michael, when we're talking with the ULs, they say, stop. We already know that there's a problem. We got it. We were talking about diversity and recruitment. The next question was, what are we going to do about it? What are your suggestions? And that's what they really want to hear. Give us a plan. Give us a strategy for working on it. We may not adapt it. Well, maybe we'll hear something, and then we end up working it out. So it's for us to try to come up with solutions. And ideally, we all work through this together. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. At this point, I'd like to open it up to discussion or questions. If anyone has any, I'm sure you all do. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time, so let's tease that out.
I had a question for Cristela, I guess for UCSD. When you talked about the different responsibilities as a part of your, or resulting from your reorganization, was there any training involved?
Do you mean training
For the new responsibilities in advance, or did this happen as a part of the transition?
Well, one thing, so we did have a training coordinator that over the course of the reorganization became appointed to as our internal communications director. So then we had a vacancy in our training coordinator position. So we recently hired a new training coordinator. And so we're starting to see some opportunities open up. One of the big things kind of call reports indicated was that supervision is a huge one for there to be more extensive training. And one of the things we actually did uncover in that process was that at the moment at the campus level, supervisors, there is required training for supervisors, but to be a supervisor, it's a non-librarian staff position that supervises more than 2 full-time employees. So that's a very limited subset of people who are actually supervising. And so there's several people who are sort of work leaders or even student work leaders. Our library depends on our student workers, and so we have lots of people that have students reporting to them. And virtually any of those work leaders and student work leaders don't get that kind of same training or resources. And so there was this huge just issue with supervision across the library and the level of supervision that people are getting. So that's a big focus for our training coordinator at this point. And so we have a lot of conversations about what that means. But in terms of training, now that people are in new roles and taking on new responsibilities, I think we're trying to have additional resources for that. So there are training funds, and there are ways of getting supplemental professional development funds. So if you do find yourself in a place where you're now taking over a whole new role that you know nothing about, there are mechanisms for going out and getting new ideas. So I think that is one area that UC San Diego has been successful, is that there is a strong value for continual learning
I would agree that there's less, although there are some, but there's less new responsibilities than there are new levels of responsibility, like supervision. And I think one thing that we're finding when we have one supervisor before, and you might have had issues or whatever, but you worked it out. Now you have 3 or more, you might have multiple ones, and then if they're inconsistent, that's a whole nother level of issue. And so there's not only, each person needs to kind of be trained to be a supervisor, but also there needs to be an organizational understanding of what a supervisor needs to do, and there's certain rules about that's kind of coming out as well. So that's the biggest issue, I agree.
And yeah, just in the reorganization in general, I can't remember, what's the term Martha keeps using for academic, administrative? Administrivia, that there was so much administrivia coming out of the reorganization, just the having to like re-examine the policies, the procedures, document new things, talk through
Communication
everything.
lines, number of emails versus not enough emails, too many over here. And,
Yeah, lots, that's been a huge challenge.
I have a question for all of the panelists. Was there any way that the faculty or other campus groups were consulted about changes and reorganizations in the library?
outside the library? Go ahead.
Sure. For Irvine, we had to tell our faculty that we were doing budget cuts. We had to tell them that serials cancellations were being done because of that. I think we talked to student groups when the library hours were being reduced. Regardless of how many people we actually talked to, the response was very loud. And I think we actually had an occupation. You know, we did students occupied the level. Videos came in. We figured out how to keep the library open that day. I think it was during finals. We did some readjustments. It came from one side to another. It's never enough. I think everybody was in shock at the time when the campus were getting hit. They wanted the library to continue to operate, so we talked to our faculty as much as we could. I don't think we did everything, but I think we were pretty open about that.
I would say for us it was, our UL put out an all-campus email from the chancellor level to say what we're doing a few times. A lot of it was internal, like even closing the science and engineering library, we didn't lose any space because it's just a wing in a larger building. So people might, and then all the same people are there, the same books are there, so they might not have even known to some extent student-wise. The biggest thing was closing the branch libraries. There was a lot with the Scripps Institute of Oceanography because it was a real important library for a long time, and a lot of promises were made about how we would hang on to their stuff, how we would keep their stuff, who would talk to them, and so forth. And we had students sit in and break into one of the place that was a more of a study hall, the research conference area, over
But
finals
again,
week.
a semester, a quarter later, like it was like it happened over the summer and it wasn't until the fall
Yeah, it was.
quarter, so months later that it clicked in like over final time.
And it wasn't our, we didn't turn it back over to the campus.
Yeah, it was
wasn't
not
our
our space.
So, yeah, so not everyone was happy, of course, but yeah, those are the big things we did.
I think one of the biggest changes we saw at Irvine was as part of this campus attention to money, the library was seen as having a lot of unused space because there were gaps between books on shelves. It was just seen as real estate. So there was an agreement made. We lost a large portion of our top floor of our science library, which is a modular unit. So we have a section for journals. That was the space that was evacuated. Campus IT actually moved into that level. I think it's the user support and administration level. So it's not servers, but it's the people components. And so we had to compress the collections on the remaining floors, which means there was a lot of loss. We took a lot of the print materials, didn't make that shift. We moved all the books over, and so we really had to do a big adjustment. There are people who still dislike that, but realistically, we've been planning to do something with serials, like reducing duplicate print holdings, where we had electronic versions. We've done some early planning to just sort of a thought piece. We were doing that in planning from collections. Like, if you're gonna do something really forward-thinking, what would it do? Of course, we're never gonna do it. So we had all these plans, and then suddenly it's like, wait, we actually have to do that? We actually had done enough thinking about it that implementation was easier. So sometimes we do stuff that is purely sort of, decision-based. We're not really thinking about it, but let's do a scenario planning. Like, what do we do if there's a massive earthquake, or if there's water damage, or suddenly we have to create an entire Persian collection from the basement, from ground floor to functional in 6 months? What would it take to do that? Because occasionally these things sort of pop up at the last minute.
Michael and Maria.
So in your collective opinions, has the reorganization changes that were made affected your abilities or others' abilities to make decisions at various levels? Has it been the same, that it's still top down? Is it now bottom up? Is it collaborative? Is it somewhere in between? For any of those scenarios that Mitchell just talked about, like, decision to move books out of the collection, is that, where is those decisions coming from? The decision to focus on this type of service versus another type of service?
So at Santa Barbara, a lot of the changes that I outlined were filling in gaps in management or administration, or clarifying roles. So I would say decision-making, like whether or not to reflow a certain floor for collections or not, or those sort of decisions. If anything, the decision-making process has improved and lines of communication are clearer.
We threw the word nimble around a lot, the idea of improving nimbleness, and it's become a bit of an ironic joke in some areas because it's made some things a lot more difficult, the reorg, because things that we used to do and had ways to do them, things that weren't obviously fitting into one of the programs, the things that fell in between when we all knew what we were doing, we're not always sure who's in charge of that now, and who do you need to ask, and the person who now is suddenly in charge of it, for example, putting up a display on the wall that we used to do all the time, now you have to fill out a form because the person in charge of it wants to be form-based, and you have to plan 6 months ahead, and it's like, what's going on here? So some things have not been nimble. There are other things that I do think will improve by having someone focused on reference or focused on instruction where they didn't exist before as a particular unit. Those people hopefully in the long run will be able to implement things in a way that said, okay, here we have a unified way, let's do instruction this way now, and we'll train people that way, and we'll do it that way, and we'll have a plan, where before everyone comes with their own instruction. Hopefully that'll be better. Other things have not been, and there's been a lot of pushback, and hopefully it gets pushed into the right ways so things can get done again, but not everything's gone smoothly.
Yeah, empowerment was definitely one of the areas that, even before the reorganization, we scored low on in that survey that we did. And so I think that's always been something that we kind of struggle with, and in some ways it's kind of the nature of our profession too. I think not everyone always feels comfortable speaking up. And so I'm hopeful that we are going through sort of a cultural change in addition, where hopefully people will start to feel more empowered to speak up. We are trying to implement, we're about to implement something within our wiki that's just a Q&A sort of based structure, so people can post questions and get answers. And I'm hoping that starts to make people feel a little more comfortable saying like, oh yeah, hey, who does this now? Or where can I find this information? And that there is a space for that kind of discussion. But I think that's something that we've kind of always struggled with. So that the library seems to struggle with people speaking up. And it goes both ways. I think it's getting our upper management to be able to listen and take in the feedback, but I also think it's getting staff to feel comfortable speaking. So.
In terms of campus involvement, we had here at Riverside funny story that most of you know, but probably it's worth to remember as a cautionary tale. Namely, when you know the crisis hit and the budget were cuts, we librarians raised a havoc and sort of, you know, screamed before the university, the campus senate, on the town halls, and our voice was heard, and the result of that was that our budget was split into two separate parts. The one was the collections that was declared sacrosanct and no cuts were allowed, and the rest including personal funds, which resulted in several layouts that as later came out proved to be unnecessary. So that was our history. I believe it is past, but I think it's worth to remember it as a caution.
But Guido, wasn't that because our management was willing to rob Peter to pay Paul? We actually suggested such a thing instead of maybe suggesting that the whole needed to be more preserved than they had planned, because that was my understanding.
My understanding, you know, we went to the Senate, we went to the town halls with a big cry that the collection is being cut, that the collection is being depleted, that there are damage, irreversible, inflicted, and the result, the next I heard was that the budget was cut into the collection fund that was to be preserved.
So we kind of suggested this cut, right?
And
Without being aware
who could know that the administration would react this way?
Not being foretold.
Everyone like to comment?
So yeah, so it's important to consider the library more than just its collections, but its people. Yeah, I definitely think that's true, that we have to argue as much for, you know, that we're the resource. You know.
I think one of the feedbacks we heard when we surveyed faculty about their perceptions of the library, they could have, say, it was odd, they had a response that library's not very interesting, I don't go there anymore, I think students just go there to study and I can get everything online. And the next step was, I value my librarian principally, and there's no way I can do my work without them. So the library is actually the people that they see. That's the interaction, that's the strength. And then when they started thinking about it, it was, well, I couldn't actually do that if that didn't exist. So if you kept the library open, but I didn't have anybody to talk to, it's completely useless. So that was helpful. And that's something UL uses when we talk a lot about trying to identify or emphasize the value of the library's faculty, try to raise that in the minds that they see that the people of the institution are equivalent, they're related in a way that needs to be mutually supported.
I'm a little confused about what the differences between San Diego and Irvine's model is for these functional areas. Because in a way it sounds similar, although Mitchell, you're talking about it like people now have one supervisor. And in San Diego, people maybe have more than one. I mean, the model here at Riverside is always, up till now, is that we, and I mean, it's a model that's based in our MOU, is that, you know, you have a primary review initiator and you may have secondary review initiators. And it sounds like you both still would have that model. So there's something I maybe don't understand. How that.
I'm not intimately knowledgeable about Irvine stuff, but it did sound like Mitchell's description was similar to ours in terms of percentages and so forth.
Yeah.
It could be, And yet, we still have a primary, everyone has a primary.
Everybody does have a primary.
Yes, and they're careful to say that you have a primary, your home program. So that, they couldn't get away with completely splitting it,
Right.
but maybe the change or the problems come from where we were to where we're going. You know, if we end up in the same spot, but they started in a different place, it might be less of a shock to the system. Because all of our functions were tied together in terms of the subject, and we had one department head for science engineering or arts or whatever it might be, the reporting line was just very different, the way we interacted and the way we did things in reviews and so forth. So that has been a shock to us in terms of just refiguring out how that works in a relationship and so forth. It's not necessarily wrong or against an MOU or anything, it's just different for us, maybe.
Okay.
And I don't know where you guys started.
Yeah, I think like one of the examples that's come up recently is telecommuting is an example. So like, let's say you report to 3 different people and, you know, you need to telecommute on a certain day.
Who do you tell?
Whose policy are you following? You know, like one area might say like very liberally go right ahead, and another might be like, I'm not so comfortable with that. So there's just been, it comes down to that administrative, yes, like how do you handle those sorts of situations, and what makes sense for one area maybe doesn't make sense for another area. So it's just become a struggle. The details, I mean, it's always those details that start to become where the issues arise.
And I did notice when you said your percentages for subject librarians, you didn't have a liaison one. And that is thrown, for me personally, that's thrown a wrench in the works. Now there's a liaison and then instruction, reference, and collection, where liaison kind of covers those other things. So splitting it up that way, I understand the reasoning behind it, but it's confused the issue some as to what really I do here, what I do there. And if you broke it up in a different way, maybe that solves some of those problems. I don't know. Maybe I figured it out.
Yeah, I think some of the changes came from, starting about 2006, we started de-emphasizing the locations. So as much as that I'm physically in a science library, we no longer had a science department as an identification, which is how the reviews were done prior. It's sort of a combination, so it's morphed over time. We used to have percentages in terms of how much do I do for collections, how much is integrated. Liaison is now assumed to be total 100% all the time, and you have to do these others. So then I'm literally trying to do a numbers game. You want me to be liaison all the time. I have 3 different departments with responsibilities, and I'm doing scholarly communications too, but I was doing an interim position as well. So I got 4 positions going on simultaneously, reporting to up to 4 different people with different timelines and expectations. So workload slips in. So as much as it was defined in terms of the plan, how we implement it has changed over time. What we finally decided to do is sort of reduce down to a primary review initiator. I have input from the others who write a letter. I really was talking to the review initiator, but we also have to implement the new MOU requirements for compensation. And I was part of that contract. I know we're just working really hard to implement all this stuff. It has all this. We share all the same characteristics, and probably it's all about interpretation of each campus. So we're all speaking the language with a different dialect and maybe a different emphasis in the language. And I think how we're